Hi, everybody. This is Jeremy Miner, technical agronomist for Channel Seeds covering Southeast Iowa, joining you here towards the end of January. Going to give you part two of the series that Matt Nelson and myself, Matt and Miner in the morning, of course, we've put together a series kind of looking back at the year 2021 and looking at the growing season. Matt, on part one of our session here a couple weeks ago, went through some of that early planting, April, May timeframe, and kind of some of the things that we learned from that time of the growing season in 2021. I'm going to cover part two, which actually will lead us into more of that vegetative and reproductive growth stage, the June, July timeframe. So follow along with me here on part two, and we'll see what we can learn today. So like I said, this is going to be part two, 2021 year in review, looking at the June and July timeframe. And I tried to look at this when I started looking at 2021. I looked as how could I bucket some of the information and the things that went on during this time frame. And I decided to come up with three what I call focus factors. And the first one is weather. Weather impacts everything, especially during a growing season, a planting season. Whether no matter what crop it is, weather always is a factor. So that's one of the things I thought about, and I'm going to break it down that way. Also going to break it into what's going on physiologically or biology or biologically, I guess, when a corn and a soybean crop are growing. What are some of the things that are going on during this time frame, especially during this vegetative and reproductive part of the growth cycle, and what happened in 2021? And then the last section, management activities. What are customers, farmers like you trying to do during the growing season to either protect the plant, kill weeds, those types of things, just management activities, and see how all these work together and what we learned from that in that June, July timeframe of 2021. So if we look at June itself, June was a warm and dry, basically a warm and dry month with spotty rainfall events. There was a large GDU accumulation. We gathered heat units really fast once we finally started warming up in that June timeframe. And the crops continued to just chug along. There wasn't a lot to go on as far as rainfall, but we had plenty of heat. So the crops were kind of doing, I guess, the roller coaster when it comes to a growing season. They were chugging along, they were going in and out of different types of stress, as you can see in this example picture here. I used Cedar County for my weather example here just because it seemed like it was a good representation of my area, especially in the northern half of the territory in east central Iowa. And it represented a lot of what was going on through most of Iowa. There were a lot of times where we went like this, stretches of 2 to 3 weeks with relatively no rainfall, pretty warm temperatures both during the day and in the night. And then, we'd run into a spurt there where we would catch, a couple of tenths, maybe an inch or so of rainfall, kind of drop the temps a little bit, and then continue on. So this is kind of what we were seeing just on and off throughout the growing season. When I took that weather data and I broke it down and looked at it on a day by day basis, you can see I highlighted here just some of the key factors to point out. It was really warm, especially in that early part of June. We were in the 80s and 90s. The overnight temperatures were in the upper 60s and in some cases the 70s, which is pretty warm. And it doesn't give the crops a chance to really kind of breathe overnight and take a rest before they get going and growing during the daytime. And then if you look at the precipitation and the rainfall there, we went um, the entire month of June, is, at least in Cedar County, with only 3.4 inches of total precip, and there were only 4 days of total precip where it was greater than a quarter of an inch. So it took a long time to get there, but we did get some crop-saving rains and really helped push that crop along. So, but again, overall, a pretty warm month, a pretty dry month, and there's a lot of things going on during this stage. If we look at the plant physiology, especially I'm kind of focusing on corn here, but I don't want to leave soybeans out. So we'll try and get some of that information in there as well. But if you look at corn specifically, there's a lot of things going on. When we get into that June timeframe, a lot of processes that equal yield are starting to really get honed in here by corn plants. So we're talking about kernel initiation, ear growth, ear length, number of rows around. The tassel is starting to show up. So lots of things going on here. Water uptake is really starting to increase, and then the main corn root system itself is starting to grow. So we're getting away from that real small nodal root system or primary root system, and we're getting more into those crown roots and brace roots, things needed for stability there. So we're doing that. And in the meantime, while all that's going on, we're increasing nutrient requirements as well throughout the plant just to keep all these processes going. So as you can see here, I pulled a plant on June 16th, and it's roughly 3 to 4 foot tall, but the nodes are really condensed. So still waiting for this plant to really kind of shoot up and take off. But I pulled the whorl out of this plant, and about 10 or 12 leaves down, I could actually find the tassel, and that's what you see in that picture right there. It's about the size of your thumbnail, but a lot of processes going on, a lot of nutrients needed, a lot of water needed as well. So speaking of water use in corn, we hear a lot of terms thrown around, especially this time of year or that time of year in that June, July timeframe: transpiration and evapotranspiration. What are they? Transpiration is essentially how much water the crop uses. Plants are living, breathing organisms. They inhale and exhale water vapor. They use water in the soil to pull in nutrients through the roots. Um, but they breathe, and they do that through stomates or stomata on the surfaces of the leaves. They're little openings that open and close, and they allow water vapor to come in. They exhale oxygen and water vapor out. It just kind of helps them regulate the processes throughout the plant when it comes to just growth. And then evapotranspiration, if you think of, obviously evaporation. Well, where does evaporation come from? It comes from the soil surface. So when we have processes going on, with relative humidity being low, we can dry out the soils really fast. If we increase wind speed, we can dry out the soils really fast. So that's just a combination of evaporation from the soil and transpiration from the plant. Now, the water use itself really starts to peak if we look at 60 days after this year or 2021's planting date of April 15th. That puts us right at about June 14th. So we really start to increase that water need or that water usage to about a tenth to maybe 1500ths per day. And then depending on what's going on with the soil, with the weather, we could lose anywhere from 400ths to 4/10ths of an inch today. So of it per day. So we're trying to keep that balance in there, keep those plants healthy, and have enough water to again regulate the plants and grow to make yield. We talked about roots a little bit ago. And again, we go away from that primary root system. We develop some seminal roots. And then now in that June timeframe, we're in the stage where we start developing crown roots, or roots that actually develop from the crown. And that becomes the main root system that the corn plant uses. We also start developing brace roots, and that's more for stability. But again, root system very important. We just noticed that in 2021, the root systems were relatively slow to develop, and it just took a while for those things to grow, just because of the weather situation we were in, and where we started turning into more of that drought type situation. Roots have to grow, but they need to have the right conditions to grow. And we talk about brace roots and stability. Corn is really acclimated to develop roots when there's enough moisture available. And that moisture has to be available not only in the plant to help develop the roots, but also available in the soil as well. And if a plant root starts to develop and senses that there is not enough moisture in the soil, it simply won't grow down there, or it will just delay growth or slow growth for a while until those conditions change. Brace roots don't want to grow into hot, dry soil. And if you think about it, it's like walking about in warm sand on a beach. If it's super hot, you really don't want to put your foot down there and walk on a really hot, sandy beach. So roots kind of act the same way. These pictures here really show an example of what I'm talking about. That picture on the left there, you can see where that root started to grow, little crown rot root started to grow. But anything, the soil was dry enough, and it just started to actually curve and point back up. Now, I'm sure that would change, but if conditions persist and we stay dry and we have dry soil conditions, we have what's known as rootless corn syndrome or floppy corn syndrome. Pick your term there. But an example of that is in this picture right here. You can see where we just don't have a lot of roots developed on those little corn seedlings. Um, they're getting blown over. The soil is dry. They're not picking up a lot of nutrients, so they're not super healthy right now. And any little wind event or anything like that will come and blow them over. So we ran into that probably more often in 2021 than we have in previous years, just based on the growing season and what we were dealing with during that time. It's also the time to talk about nutrient uptake. And as you can see here, on this graph here, we look at the big three: nitrogen, um, phosphorus, and potassium. And you can see here just with these graph lines here about how important they are, and then about when things start to take off for that plant and nutrient need, especially in corn here. The thing I wanted to point out here is potassium. Look how early that plants need potassium and how soon that uptake really takes off versus nitrogen or phosphorus. That's one thing that we noticed a lot in 2021, and I think it's something that's really key to point out here. So when we talk about potassium itself or K2O, potash, whatever, I'm just going to call it potassium or K. In its nutrient available form, 2/3 of that potassium uptake actually happens during the vegetative growth of the plant. So it's starting early, just like we saw on that graph, and it becomes obviously more limited during stress. Other nutrients become less available as well. But potassium is pretty darn important. It does a lot of things in the plant that a lot of people don't think about until we have issues like we had with the drought of 2021. Potassium helps maintain turgor pressure. Now, I know some of you may have heard that term before, but if you haven't, what that means, turgor pressure is actually pressure exerted by fluids in plant cells. So, what does that mean? If you have a plant that has enough water and has enough nutrients, what does it look like? It looks like a plant. But when we run out of turgor pressure, then what do we have? We have plants that start to wilt. They start to look that gray color and just don't look healthy at all. Well, that's what potassium helps with. And the way that it helps with not just turgor pressure within the cells, but the way that it helps keep plants healthy is by regulating the opening and closing of those stomata that we talked about earlier. We talked about water vapor, carbon dioxide coming into the plant, water vapor and oxygen flowing out of the plant. When potassium is available in a full form, it opens and closes those stomata perfectly just to relieve the pressure and to bring in more nutrients and air. But when we are in drought conditions or under drought stress, we have low levels of potassium there. And what happens then is that those stomata actually open and close much more slowly. And when they do that, that allows available nutrients or moisture specifically to leave the plant. And that's where we get wilting and some of the stress that we saw this year. Potassium deficiencies are linked to a lot of other things, and that's why we call it the quality nutrient because it affects a lot of factors that impact the quality of our grain and our plants. When we have potassium deficient plants, we're looking at lower tolerance to heat and drought stress. We have increased susceptibility to leaf and root stalk infections, fusarium crown rot. Those things start to sneak in on us. We limit the availability or the uptake of other primary nutrients like nitrogen. So when we're limited on one, we can affect the impact of another nutrient. So again, things just start to snowball here when it comes to potassium, and then an impact on the other quality things that we were talking about, like test weight. We usually have smaller kernels, maybe not as deep kernels. Is what we're used to seeing, and we can start to compromise stalk integrity. So that's something that really causes concerns, and that's something we'll talk about in part 3. But again, potassium, very important. If you're out scouting your fields early, this is some of the visual symptomology you'd be seeing. Potassium is very highly mobile in the plant, so deficiency symptoms will usually occur first on some of those lower leaves, but then if it stays deficient, it'll move up the plant. But you can see on the left there, those soybean plants have a really yellow leaf, mostly yellow on the outside ridge there. They can get a little brown and crispy on the edges there. That's what we see mostly on like that picture on the right there with corn. We usually see those leaf margins turning quite yellow and eventually can just start dying and turning brown. So that's what we noticed a lot more of this year. Or I'm sorry, I say this year, I mean 2021. And that's what we were seeing as far as deficient symptoms in uh, in corn and soybeans. From a management perspective, we were dealing with crop development challenges. Matt talked about uneven emergence in part 1. That continues on, obviously, in June and July, especially for corn. Um, Corn, when it starts uneven, it pretty much stays uneven. There's really no chance for those plants to catch up. The taller plants are going to start shading out those smaller ones. Um, and then we saw the impact of too much downforce, and you can see with those pictures of the roots there. Once we get that hard pan set up, um, below crop root systems, if it turns off dry, there's nothing to soften that up and allow those roots to penetrate through. So they'll find the easiest way possible to get down into the soil. And you can see that plant picture on the left there, those roots that kind of snuck over the edge and started coming down. The picture on the right, we had sidewall compaction. So that is a set of roots that's really narrow. They're only going down. They're not able to spread out, and again, causing some problems there with standability on those plants. We also had weed control challenges. So When we have limited moisture in our pre-time frame, like Matt was talking about in that April May, we didn't activate herbicides. Same thing happened last year in our post applications where we had limited moisture, so we had limited activity of some of our key actives that we put out there for post herbicide applications, and the weeds basically got dinged up, but they may not have specifically died. Um, Weeds are amazing, in a good way and a bad way, I guess. We know they cause problems with yield, but how they do that, basically they metabolize those chemicals slowly, and they end up developing a thicker cuticle, a thicker skin. So when we put those herbicides out there, they have to really work to get through that cuticle in order to get into the weed's tissues and then kill it. And when we're under stress like that, plants are trying to protect themselves, whether they're weeds or whether they're corn or soybeans. And again, a lot of dinged up weeds, but not a really good kill or as effective kill as what we're used to seeing when we have more normal rainfall situations. And then crop injury as well. We were seeing some of that. That picture down below, you can see those soybeans there. Lots of oils going in some of those post application products. So we're seeing instances, or at least we saw instances where we had a lot of speckling on leaves, where we had some injury there where the herbicide just basically sat there. And uh, that's how a plant works. Basically, it tries to metabolize those products, and when it can't, that's when you get leaf injury as well. Here's some examples here of, again, some of the challenges. I have an iPad. That iPad is 9.5 inches tall. So how tall do you think that mare's tail is right next to it? About 2x. We probably waited a little too long to get to the mare's tail here. And again, you can see a couple of plants kind of, twisted up with a growth regulator application, but the other one is pretty tall yet. And I just have a hard time thinking that that weed is just going to turn over and die on us when it's standing that tall and has a lot of green leaves on it. So, and then that picture on the right there, you can see that the longer we wait to take care of weeds, the bigger of a problem we got. And man, does that not tell a story or what? Those grasses there, really, once they start to get thick, they're competing for the same nutrients. They're competing for the same everything as the crops that we're growing. And boy, that can really impact yields. So we have to be really careful when it comes to controlling weeds early and making sure we get out there with multiple modes of action so we can head them off. Nutrient deficiencies, we talked about those a little bit earlier with some of the big three. And they really started to show up in June, which is much earlier than what we're used to seeing. A lot of the eroded hillsides were showing up pretty quickly. Compacted areas just um, inside of gateways and things like that. Compacted areas, we could see that. And then that picture on the right, that was from Muscatine County. If you know Muscatine County at all, it's over by the Mississippi River, river bottom ground. Lots of sand included there. So we were really starting to see those fields stress much earlier just due to the lack of rainfall. One thing to think about, though, or to consider is that, crop roots didn't have to grow very far to get to some of that fertilizer that was spread out, just simply because we didn't have a lot of moisture. When we get a lot of moisture, we can move fertility down through the soil profile. And when we don't get it, it basically just sits there. So if you think about how crop roots grow, if they hit that fertility layer and everything is right there and they can get everything they need, they're not going to force themselves to grow through that and get as robust as maybe they need to be. And if they're under stress, they're not going to grow fast at all. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to fertility and having low rainfall, um, and just affecting that crop growth and really causing some problems, especially on some of those lighter soils. So we can finally move into July, which is kind of like that's when all the magic happens, right? We're looking at pollination in corn and flowering in soybeans, which is probably already happening right in that time frame. We had large accumulation of GDUs still continuing in the weather profile. Corn rootworm, so insect feeding and hatching started much sooner than we probably thought it would, and fungicide application. So when it comes from a management perspective, we're pretty much done killing weeds, and now we're trying to protect the crop and protect the yield that is out there with fungicide application. So that's what we're doing in July. We go back to the Cedar County example here. Again, we caught a little bit of rain in June, and then we skipped a couple of days, maybe a week or so, and then about perfect timing. Right in that July 7th, July 15th timeframe, at least in Cedar County, we caught a good drop in temps, which really kind of eased the stress off of our crops. And then we picked up some pretty decent rainfall. Not great, but enough to really just kind of help put the pedal back down as far as crops developing. So, and then you can see towards once we got past that 15th of July timeframe, things dried out again. The heat cranked up, the nighttime temperatures cranked up, and we went another good stretch without rainfall. So, if you look at that from a daily perspective again, um, only about half the month where we had temperatures above 85 degrees, which isn't too bad, especially for July. We accumulated a load of GDUs, though. Accumulated over 700 in Cedar County alone, 737. So that means we had some warm nighttime temperatures, and that really can stress out plants too, just because, again, it's like running a marathon, but when you try to sprint through the night, that can cause problems as well. We had 24 days with zero precip. So, I mean, it was exceptionally dry. We were lucky we caught the rains that we did in July, but again, a pretty stressful month indeed. Again, back to water usage. Our peak water usage usually hits about now, especially in July, where we can use up to maybe 2/10 of an inch, maybe a quarter of an inch per day. And that's just the actual need. The water loss probably hits up towards that 4/10 of an inch per day. Again, so a lot of water needed right now, and we just weren't getting a lot of it during July. From a fertility perspective, most or two-thirds, three-quarters of the nutrient like N and P or N and K actually, 75% of that uptake has already happened, and 50% of our total P is already gone up into the plants. So under stress, that can really be limited. Again, we talked about the slow root development, the limited root development, and then just having enough moisture to pull that fertility out of the soil and get it into the plants. It was a tough one, especially when we turned in July, when we start into those reproductive stages there. It's a good time to call out here that Mother Nature can really dictate what side of the stress factor we're on. It's important to point out, learn these points that corn that is stressed before pollination, the relative maturity or the maturity of the corn plants themselves actually slows down. But then as we get after pollination, what does that plant want to do? That plant wants to make seed and it wants to be done. So we actually speed up the relative maturity process once we get through pollination and those kernels have started to develop. So it's a good thing to point out there. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about soybeans and the insect problems that we had this year. So again, we had patches out there that showed up much earlier than maybe what we were used to seeing, and that was a lot of that was due to soybean cyst nematode. Here's some great pictures here of what those soybean nodules look like. So the nodules that actually fix nitrogen out of the soil, that's what you're looking at there with the pink arrow. But those little bitty yellow circles there, those are soybean cysts and the nematodes actually growing on plant roots there. So we were seeing some little circles out in the field where we knew we had high levels of soybean cyst nematode out there. So they were causing problems. The bigger problem, though, and maybe you guys heard about it, were the corn rootworms that were hatching and feeding. Boy, that started early this year. 50% of that egg hatch happens between when we accumulate 684 to 767 GDUs. So again, if we're collecting 700 a month, obviously this started probably a couple of weeks earlier than what we were doing here or what we were seeing here. So these are in July, and that feeding's already started. We were seeing some major problems. At Bear Crop Science, we do track as best we can those beetles per trap per day. And you can see with the red dots here, we were capturing in a lot of those traps over almost 1,000 traps total. We were collecting 5+ beetles per day across Iowa. So again, pretty thick with corn rootworm out there. And if you think back to the winter of 2020, was not really that cold. We had some cold stretches there, especially as we got into February of 21, but really just nothing to really sink frost deep and get things super cold and have any sort of heaving that would break up those corn rootworm eggs and do any damage to lower the populations there. So lots of bugs that were ready to hatch, and we just had the perfect weather for that hatch to continue. Doing some monitoring and some comparisons there. Just three key ones to really point out here. The percent of cornfields that were above that economic threshold of 2 beetles per trap per day went up to 38% in 2021. and that was 22% in 2020. So a pretty big jump there. The percent of continuous cornfields that were sampled that were above that economic threshold, that jumped up to 52% in 2021. So there was a thick mass of corn rootworm bugs out there, larvae feeding and beetles starting to develop and fly through the air. And then look at that bottom point there. That one's pretty important to look at. That was the percent of first year corn on cornfields. So corn that was planted in a rotation. So right after soybeans. So first year corn. Um, in rotation there. And man, that percentage jumped from 4% in 2020 to 17% in 2021. So 2022, we'll have to see where that goes, but we do forecast based on the modeling and the information that we collect. And again, just looking at this map here, put Iowa right in the middle, and wow, it could be a pretty thick year. A lot of factors have to come together for this to really take shape. But again, if you had some heavy pressure, heavy corn rootworm pressure last year in 2021, chances are pretty good it's going to be hot again in 2022. But not something that we're looking forward to, but something to be paying attention to for sure. And but we did get a chance, I guess, to look at some of the new traits that we have coming down the pipeline compared to our competitors. So Smart Stacks Pro, which are as additional is our additional new mode of action. Um, RNAi that is going to help protect against corn rootworm larvae feeding. We had that out across the state and across the Midwest, and compared to some of our competitor traits that are out there, you can see the differences here. We had some major lodging starting to happen in our competitor products, and this picture was taken by myself in July. Major feeding going on. Here's just a close-up of a couple of those really bad ones there, but you can see Smart Stacks Pro, we're certainly glad to have it. It is not a silver bullet, but it is certainly one of those bullets that's good to have in the arsenal. And we'll talk about ways to use Smart Stacks Pro in your management programs here coming up. Fungicides, we talked about them briefly at the beginning of this segment, but fungicides very important this year, and they can make a huge difference in stress years, especially when you're looking at plant-to-plant competition in higher population areas or higher population fields. When we have more residue out there, we usually start dealing. We're impacted by more diseases starting to flare up. 2021 a little bit different just because of the heat and the drought, but a factor nonetheless. And then we have increasing more expensive inputs that we're trying to protect out here. We know what's going on with fertility. We want to protect those plants and make sure that they're using nutrients as efficiently as possible. Fungicides help us do that. The best ROI target opportunities for fungicides, basically using on high yield or high responding acres. So your top end yield acres, that's usually where you have the highest yield potential. That's where you want to target your fungicide applications to protect that highest producing yield acre. Um, Products that are known to respond to fungicides. Obviously, if you have products that are maybe a little bit more average for leaf diseases, say you've got a 21079 that really responds to fungicide. It's a good stress tolerant product, but it can respond to fungicide and helps out with that fusarium crown rot. That'd be one that I would target. There's a couple of other products out there that like 20425, Stacks and Double Pro. Those things they're average for leaf diseases and usually can benefit from a fungicide application. We're out there trying to protect plant health, which in turn protects the plant yield. So what did we learn from 2021 in June and July? We learned that channel genetics are still a very solid option. Obviously, I wouldn't be here telling you that if I didn't believe in it. But channel genetics really powered through this year, last year's crop season, 2021. We have products that have great stress tolerance on their own without the drought guard gene. So if you look at products, I look at my relative maturity, like products like 20787 Double Pro, 20838, great natural stress tolerance there. They still need water to really hit their maximum potential. But again, to have products that have natural stress tolerance really sets us up for good yield potential in stressful years, and they did last year. And then products with the drought guard gene. So 21079, we just talked about that one. 21079 drought guard double pro, 21478 drought guard double pro, and even our tough acre products like 21530 drought guard double pro. Those are products there that have stress tolerance, but they have a drought gene that actually helps them regulate their water usage, and increase and protect that yield potential. So lots of products in the stable, lots of products that helped us out during the drought times of July in 2021. We started seeing some separation from some of these newer products. Not that the older products are bad, the 21319s, even the 21393s, still good, but we started seeing a little bit of separation just based on the genetics that are coming out. We learned that fertility is even more critical in a drought stress year. So we looked at some of those pictures where we saw areas that were um, more nutrient limited. They were clearly defined out there. Those are good things to go out and mark and make sure that you have a good idea where those are at, so you can continuously check those um, and keep an eye on them, and just know that those are the problem areas of the fields. Insects, the insect issue isn't going away. We had the perfect storm for corn rootworm development and the hatch and root feeding this year. We learned that that product or that problem really isn't going to go away, and we really need to be proactive when we're dealing with that. We had good overall pollination, flowering, seed set. Um, so we were set up to have some pretty good yields at the end of 2021. Again, we had a specific time set there where we lessened the heat, we got good moisture, we were able to put the pedal down and start developing some of those ears that were bringing us the big yields come fall. Fungicides, again, very helpful in 2021. They helped us maintain the overall health of the plant factory, and that's what we need to do. Sometimes we see huge yield bumps from fungicide usage, but under stress conditions, we're trying to maintain what we can there. So, and we believe that fungicide usage this year, you could really tell a difference from where you had fungicide sprayed and where you did. So, what can we apply towards the 2022 crop season? Scouting. Scouting is still huge. It's great to do it from the pickup at 55 mile an hour, but man, did we find out that there are a lot of things going on in the fields in 2021. If we can scout and catch those issues early, that allows us to do some proactive management. You know, whether it's nitrogen deficiency, we can apply different forms of nitrogen at different times. Um, Insect issues, you know, we can go out there and beetle bomb in the fall if we need to. Um, it encourages the use of seed treatments, those types of things. But anyway, scouting in general, just understanding what's going on, dig some plants up, what's going on below ground. We can look at root masses and see how big they are, see if we have any compaction issues going on, things that we have to deal with that maybe change our level of maybe our harvest priorities, things like that. So just something to consider there. That's something that we learned that we can apply towards 2022. Scouting still important. Starting with solid genetics and product placement is going to maximize yield potential. That goes without saying. It's always good to sit down with your technical agronomist, your FSR, or your seedsman and review some of the new products, some of the old products. Look at and compare and contrast some of the root and stock scores, the standability scores. Understand planting populations of some of these products and disease ratings. Just because something has a poor rating or less than average rating doesn't mean that it's bad, because everything has to come together for maybe that particular score to really become an impact factor there. So, but anyway, those are good things to think about. And when you have a plan and you've got a product place, it's always best to stick to it and don't second guess yourself. Do the best to place the products where you need to, and then stick to that plan. Fertility needs, very important no matter what, and unfortunately, no matter the price. And we're feeling the pinch this year. I know a lot of you guys are with the price of fertility inputs. Yeah, um, things are going up, things are up, but again, it's something that the plant needs, and it doesn't pay to skimp on any of those. It's also a good time to talk about soil tests and how they can pay for themselves. Everything starts with balanced fertility. So if you've taken soil tests last fall and you've got them, make sure you're reading up on those, understanding what fields are acting like what fields need more nutrients versus others. Understand soil pH and how that can impact the availability of some nutrients. It's just a good time to be looking at soil tests and really setting a plan up for making sure that you have all your fertility needs in place before we get the planters rolling in 2022. Corn rootworm, we just talked about that. That will be a factor. I really don't see any reason why it would not be a factor unless something major happens. You know, significant rainfall events can really lessen the pressure there. during the growing season. But again, something to be thinking about and evaluating management strategies around that, and make sure you implement options. Crop rotation is big. If you can do anything to starve out corn rootworms, starvation being the key word there, starving them out, it's crop rotation. Give them something else that they cannot eat. So I understand there's a lot of cattle producers out there, and rotation can be hard. But even if you can pick one select field and rotate that to soybeans and really change things around, you really want to be considering doing that. Um, Getting out of that once you get out of that soybean rotation, going back to a double pro with soil applied insecticide. Smart Stacks products are still good below ground products. We know that there's heavy pressure out there, so we just need to evaluate how heavy that pressure was in 2021, so we can evaluate whether it be rotation or just a different trait strategy or non-traded strategy altogether would be the place to go in order to affect them. And then have herbicide plants, multiple herbicide plants. There's shortages of chemicals out there, so we just want to make sure that we're thinking about, what's it going to take care of weeds in 2022. So, evaluate your fields from 2021, what fields had the worst pressure, and then develop maybe one or two strategies there. We want to make sure that we have overlapping residuals, multiple modes of action, and we want to spray by calendar date. I think that's something that gets overlooked a lot, but 14 to 21 days after emergence, we want to make sure that we're out there putting some sort of overlapping residual, multiple mode of action products out there actually, just to make sure that we've got weeds under control. When we don't control them, they rob us, and they rob us hard, especially in stress years, by taking away nutrients and moisture from crop plants. And it's just something we got to pay attention to. And then we talk about targeted use of fungicides to maximize ROI. We want to target those usages on high yield responding fields. We want to target products that are known to respond to fungicides. So be looking at those and be talking to your seedsman and your field sales rep about those products. And then in known high disease or high risk areas, so long-term corn on corn or just continuous corn in general, those are probably the fields we want to be targeting and looking at for implementing a fungicide plan, or to keep those plants healthy and give us the highest yield potential we can get. So guys, thanks for coming along with me on the ride here for part two of our session here on the look back at 2021 during the growing season. Um, that's what I've got for you right now. We looked at the vegetative and reproductive growing stages there of 2021. If you had a chance or haven't had a chance, go back and look at Matt Nelson's part one of this particular series here. Start with that one and then look at this one here. It'll all flow together here. Matt and I will get back together in a couple of weeks here, and we'll kind of summarize, grain fill and harvest period of 2021. um, a rough year for a lot of us, but there were a lot of things that we learned that we can apply into 2022. So stay tuned for that session coming up in a couple of weeks. Until then, you can follow Matt and I on Twitter, and in a couple of weeks we'll be back with part three of our 2021 year in review. But until then, thanks a lot everybody for joining me, and have a great rest of the day.